Hello colleagues, my name is Amit Jain and I will discuss with you SA 610 using the work of internal auditors, and this part relates to using the work of internal auditors under a direct assistance role. It is important to determine whether the internal auditor can be used to provide direct assistance for purposes of the audit, and when such an evaluation has been made, determine the nature and extent of work that can be assigned to the internal auditor in providing direct assistance. If using the internal audit to provide direct assistance is not prohibited by laws and regulations, and the external auditor plans to use the work of internal audit, the external auditor has to evaluate the existence and significance of threats to objectivity and level of competence of internal auditor. And external auditors should not use internal audit to provide direct assistance if there are significant threats to objectivity of the internal audit or the internal auditor lacks competence to perform the proposed work. In determining the nature and extent of work that can be assigned to an internal auditor and the nature, timing, and extent of direction supervision, the external auditor has to consider some important aspects. This relates to the amount of judgment involved in planning and performing the relevant procedures and evaluating the audit evidence gathered. Significant judgments include the following: assessing the risks of material misstatements, assessing the sufficiency of tests involved, also assessing the use of going concern, evaluating the significant accounting matters, evaluating the adequacy of presentation and disclosure, and other matters affecting the audit report. Another important aspect is assessing the risk of material misstatement. Now, what we do in this case? For example, where the valuation of recoverability of receivables is assessed to be higher, a risk of material misstatement. In this case, while an aging report may be tested by the internal auditor, the adequacy of provisioning would be an element of significant judgment, which the auditor or the external auditor should perform himself. The external auditor should also consider the evaluations of existence and significance of threat to objectivity and level of competence of the internal audit. And another example is, for example, relating to external confirmations, which is being performed under SA 505. In this case, the external auditor should ensure that the confirmations are sent under direct supervision. That work should not be delegated to an internal auditor. The external auditor should not use the internal audit to provide direct assistance to perform procedures that involve significant judgments, as we discussed earlier, that relate to higher assessed risk of material misstatements, that relates to work which internal auditor is involved and which has already been or being reported to the management or to those charged with governance, or relates to decisions the external auditor has to make in accordance with this auditing standard. The external auditor, in communicating with those charged with governance, an overview of planned scope and timing of audit in accordance with SA 260 should perform the following. He should communicate the nature and extent of planned use of internal audit to provide direct assistance to reach at a mutual understanding so as to ensure that the reliance on internal audit is not too excessive. The external auditor should evaluate whether, in aggregate, using the internal audit to provide direct assistance to the extent planned, together with this planned use of work of the internal audit function, which we talked about in part 1, would still result in the external auditor being sufficiently involved in the entire audit. Before using internal audit to provide direct assistance, the external auditor should obtain a written agreement from an authorized representative of the entity that the internal audit will be allowed to follow the instructions of the external auditor and that the entity will not intervene in the work in which the internal audit performs to maintain the objectivity. And from an internal audit that they will keep confidential specific matters as are instructed by the external auditor and inform the external auditor in case of any threat to the objectivity. The external auditor should direct, supervise, and review the work performed by the internal auditor in accordance with SA 220. The direction, supervision, and review by the external auditor should be sufficient, and the external auditor should be satisfied that the internal audit has obtained sufficient appropriate evidence to support the conclusion based on that work. In directing, supervising, and reviewing the work performed by the internal audit, the external audit should remain alert to indications that external audit evaluations with respect to existence and significance of threats to objectivity and the competence. If using the work of the internal audit function, documentation by the external auditor is very important. The external auditor should document the evaluation which is made in determining whether the function of the internal audit, which includes the status, the policies and procedures that should support the objectivity of the internal audit, the level of competence of the internal audit function, and whether this function applies systemic and disciplined approach, including quality control. The external auditor should also document the nature and extent of work used and the basis for that decision made, and the audit procedures that are performed by the external auditor to evaluate the adequacy of the work. The external auditor should also document the evaluation of existence and significance of threats to the objectivity and the level of competence of internal audit used to provide direct assistance. He should also document the basis for that decision regarding the nature and timing and extent of the work, who reviewed the work performed, and the date of that review and extent of that review. That should be also documented in accordance with SA 230. Written agreements obtained from an authorized representative of the entity as well as the internal audit, which we discussed earlier, and the working papers prepared by the internal audit who provided such direct assistance. The documentation is an important aspect as well. With that, we come to an end. Part 2. Thank you very much.